Well, hello again. This is Dr. Ronald Ritchie bringing you another presentation, and this one is called Superior Nutrition for a Super You. Very simply, this is how to make yourself better without hardly trying and getting an improved diet. In America today, our dietary standards are quite poor. If you have checked and watched any TV at all lately, you'll see advertisements on TV that 80% of Americans try hard to have a good diet. Well, that's a whole question as to what is a good diet, which we're going to talk about today. But they say 90% of Americans, and this is a study through the NIH, that says that 90% of Americans are nutritionally deficient in some way. And that is terrible in a country where we have more food to eat than people consume, and so much is thrown out every day. Well, what's thrown out every day should be thrown out because most of it's garbage. So let's go ahead and get started. What is a good diet? Well, I'm going to tell you some things that it's not and some interesting concepts. This first concept is called the obesogenic society construct. This term, obesogenic, was coined by a Surgeon General several years ago. And it is a word that she described as our society's activity as a whole creates the structure to cause people to be fat and overweight. And just think about this for a moment. When we go someplace to meet with friends, what do? Mostly we eat. We go to entertainment, like a baseball game, a football game, even a movie. What do? We eat. You go out and meet friends just to hang out for a while. What do? You eat or drink something. When you're at home alone and you're tired and depressed, what do? You eat. And when we eat too much. And when we eat what advertising tells us tastes good and is wonderful to look at. And that really is all high carbohydrate, high sugar, high chemically intervened foods that are absolutely horrible for us. What do? This whole concept creates decreased activity and increased caloric intake of the wrong kinds of foods that creates the environment to cause everyone to be fat. There are some interesting statistics that you can find if you look at the National Institute of Health. And one of those interesting statistics is a study of obesity in America over a long period of time. And this study shows that in the 1940s, there were only 2 out of the 50 states in which they considered 25% of the population to be overweight or obese. That was in the 1940s. In the 1990s, 42 of the 50 states in the United States have 25% or more of the population that is considered obese. And obese is being roughly 30% over your optimal body weight. Simply, that means everybody's carrying around 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, and more pounds of weight than they really should have. Why all this change? Well, if you take that study and look at studies and trends in food and diets and the types of foods people eat, that obesity increase parallels the kinds of foods that we eat in our lives, which are primarily high carbohydrate foods and excessive consumptions of those high carbohydrate foods, which includes not only things that we eat but things that we drink. Well, another thing that a good diet is not is a fad or a program. You know, you see Nutrisystems, you see all of the other ones. Let's see, well, what are some of these others that are out there? All these different systems and plans. Well, these fads and programs aren't necessarily good. You know what the recidivism rate is on all these dietary programs? Now, recidivism just means go back to the way it was before you started. It's 100%. Why is it 100%? That's because as long as you're on the program, as long as you're eating that food, as long as you're doing just that, then you will lose weight. And you will lose weight. But once the program is over, or once you get out of the program, you go right back to the dietary plans you used to have. You eat the way you used to eat, and all that weight comes back. And they have found studies, and this is through that TV show The Biggest Loser. They show studies that people that lose a lot of weight very quickly not only regain all the weight they lost, but they gain more back because the body chemistry has been negatively affected that causes the body to want to gain even more weight back than was lost originally. So a good diet is not a fad or a program. Well, another fallacy that went on for quite some time and is still present a little bit today is the low-fat food fallacy. Fats in foods are the highest calorie producers, but high-fat foods is not something we like to eat in our country. Yes, there's some fat, and unfortunately the main fat that we get is through fried foods. If we didn't eat so many fried things, we wouldn't eat too much fat at all. But eating low fat doesn't get you fewer calories. As a matter of fact, if you look at the labels, if you look at how they have to make low-fat food, in order to make low-fat food taste good, you have to add more carbohydrates because proteins have almost no flavor. So they put higher carbohydrates. Low-fat foods have lower fats, that's true, but they have higher carbohydrates. So what you're doing is trading one problem for another. You're not solving anything. So that is also a fallacy. The other one is the prepared meals problem. And this is where you have a program where you purchase your pre-prepared meals and you have to eat certain things at certain times every day. Do you lose weight with these? Yes. Is it a good diet? No. And it's not a good diet for two primary reasons. Number one, it's usually extraordinarily low in carbohydrates, much too low for health, in the 1,000 calories a day, which is 1/3 of the caloric demand of the average adult. Yes, you'll lose weight, but is it healthy? The answer is really no. The other problem is that as long as you're eating these prepared meals, these boxed meals, well, you're kind of okay. But as soon as you stop, well, here we go right back to the Obesogenic Society construct. You go right back to your diet plan that you have in your head, which you don't even realize you have, and then you're back to the same weight, you're back to the same lousy diet programs, and you're back to the same problem, except worse. Well, what is a good diet? It is a plan that meets healthy bodily needs. It's not some kind of super plan that has somebody planned out great stuff. There's lots of that out there. But really, honestly, it has to be something you can perform on an everyday basis without thinking about it too hard. Because if you have to think about it that hard, if you have to work on it that hard to make sure you're in the plan, that's a guaranteed failure. Eventually, in enough time, 6 weeks, 3 months, a year later, you'll be off of the plan because you have to put too much energy and time into thinking about how you eat. And people just don't want to do that. It's just something we would rather spend our mental energy and time doing something else rather than feeling we're punishing ourselves by a dietary plan. Well, let's talk about good versus bad. In this world, there's lots of good and there's lots of bad. Well, we're going to talk about dietarily good versus bad. The first one is good fats versus bad fats. And yes, there are good fats. And we need to consume those good fats. When you eat a low-fat diet, you not only get rid of some of the bad, you get rid of most of the good, and then you end up nutritionally deficient in those necessary, essential fatty acids that are required for good health. Well, bad fats are created. Well, bad fats come in two ways. One is they're part of the foodstuffs that we eat, especially processed foodstuffs. But also they're created by temperature. High temperature cooking in fats and oils will generate trans fatty acids and other rancid fats that are damaging to our cells. And that is, an oil, a bad fat, is one that turns rancid quickly. If it becomes rancid and smelly and cloudy quickly, then that's a bad fat because it oxidizes, and that oxidized acid, that oxidized fatty acid and oil is what damages our body with free radicals. So if it is labile to high temperature, that is, if it's damaged quickly by high temperature, well, it's usually a good fat. And if it doesn't turn rancid quickly, that's usually a good fat. So we have to have some education on what are good fats and bad fats. And there is a group of fatty acids called essential fatty acids, or EFAs, that are, as the first word says, essential, necessary to health. And those are usually, and I'll use this term, the fish oils. Be careful about fish oils and the fish oil fad. That is really a big growth market economically for companies these days, and that's why they're camping on it, because people say, oh, I need fish oils, and you really don't know what you're talking about, and they feed you a line, and you take it hook, line, and sinker. So be careful about that. Another good versus bad is carbohydrates. There are good carbs, and there are bad carbs. Well, the good carbs convert into basic sugars, glucose, very slowly. It takes time for our body to break down those complex carbohydrates into sugars, and that is good for insulin. That is good for blood sugar levels. That is good for keeping that high intake of sugar to turn right into fat before it's burned up as energy. And a carbohydrate that quickly turns into sugar is a bad carbohydrate. And I'll give you a perfect example. If you will take some white rice, plain white rice, and put a spoonful of it in your mouth, and then chew it up and mush it around really good. Don't swallow it. Keep it in your mouth and mush it up really, really good. You'll notice that it takes quite a while before it has any sweet taste to it at all. That's a complex carbohydrate. Now take a piece of potato, baked potato please, no French fries, don't put anything on it, just plain baked potato. Put it in your mouth and mush it up just like you did the rice. What you will find is that within a matter of 15 to 20 seconds, it will already start tasting sweet. And that means just the enzymes in your saliva has started to break that down into sugar that quickly. Potatoes are the #1 bad carbohydrate consumed in the U.S. hands down. It is bad. If everyone did nothing but stop eating potatoes, your caloric intake of excess bad carbohydrates would reduce substantially, and I mean very quickly. So good carbs versus bad carbs. How quickly do they convert to sugar? There's a neat little book about carbohydrates. There's one called Carb King. You can usually find it in all kinds of secondhand bookstores. And it gives you the glycemic index of foods. And the glycemic index is just how quickly does a carbohydrate turn to sugar. A high glycemic index means it turns very quickly. A low glycemic index means it takes a lot of time. And you want the low glycemic or complex carbohydrates. Well, the last one is good snacks versus bad snacks. Well, this one should be a no-brainer, but often it is not. Complex and raw foods are the best good snacks. If it's sweet when you put it in your mouth, it's already sugar. It's already going to spike your insulin level. It's already going to turn all that sugar that you consume right into fat before your body has a chance to burn it up, and is just not good for you. So complex raw foods are the best. How much should I eat? Well, that's a really good question. I get that question asked to me by my patients all the time. How much should I eat? Well, it should be based upon the divided plate concept. Well, that's one of the ways. We're going to talk about several ways in which we can determine how much we should eat. And you will find this on the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare's website, the divided plate concept. This focuses on the types of foods, and it should be 20% fruit, 20% protein, 30% grain, and 30% vegetables. Now, if this works for you, if this is something that, boy, this makes sense to me and I can really do it, then that's what you should do. But the divided plate, look at what it does. It keeps fruit and grains and vegetables at 80% of the diet. And look at this, vegetables at 30 and fruit at 20. 50% of your diet would be vegetables. That is the single biggest problem in the American diet also, is the lack of consumption of raw fruits and vegetables. But the divided plate concept. There's also another one called the size of my fist concept. This particular one is if you ball up your hand and you see your fist from your wrist forward, that's the total of volume of food you should eat at any one sitting. Well, what this does is make your meals much smaller, and you have 5 meals a day instead of 3. And what this does is gives you better glycemic control. Now, better glycemic control very simply means that if you have a tendency to blood sugar problems, if you start to get a headache, and that's your trigger to know it's time to eat, or if you feel very lethargic after you eat, then most likely those two things indicate your blood sugar is not being handled well. This is a good way to do it because you eat small meals multiple times a day, and it keeps your blood sugar from going too high or too low. Well, another way is based upon caloric need. This is the best way. This is the way that gives your body what you need in the right ratios, the right amounts, and is customized just for you. But it's also the way that requires the most education, which a lot of people don't want. They come to the doctor and they say, "Tell me what I should do." They just want to be told. They don't want to think for themselves. Well, this is actually the best way. It should be based upon caloric need. It should be the benchmark for any diet because it's based on age, sex, height, weight, basal metabolic rate, and activity, because it's an accurate measure of your bodily needs. This is the best way. The way this is calculated is through the Harris-Benedict equation. And if for all you people who love the internet, you can Google Harris-Benedict equation and come up with 1,000 sites that will have this equation automated for you, where you can put this in and get your BMR and your daily caloric benchmark. Okay, and two places where I can find them very easily, and it's got some great information. It's freedieting.org and paleoz.com. Paleoz.com is Australian, has some really interesting stuff about kangaroo meat and things like that, but it really is interesting. So these are two organizations where you can find this calculation for basal metabolic rate, and that right there is the key, BMR. Well, guidelines for a superior diet, let's talk about those specifically. It should not be based upon BMI. BMI is something that is now required for physicians to calculate on patients, but it is a very loose guideline, very loose, and it is really kind of inappropriate most of the time because it's now become, well, if your BMI is over 30, well, you're unhealthy and you're sick. And that's not necessarily so. And your BMI is 18, so you're too underweight and you're sick. Well, that may not necessarily be so either. So BMI is not a very good way. It kind of pigeonholes people, and really actually calculating BMI has skewed the calculations of numbers of people that are overweight and obese because of its misapplication. What is better is the waist-hip ratio. This is the better way to do it. A waist-hip ratio is measured around the middle section of the body, and that is halfway between the iliac crest and the ribs. And if you don't know where that is, well, it's if you put your fingers down on your tips of your fingers on the bones of at your belt line, and your thumb at your ribs when you're standing up straight, and your index finger goes in the middle. That's the waist area that you measure. And the hip area you measure is around the widest area of the buttock. If you measure those, what you will find is that if it is 0.8, you take the waist divided by the hip. If it comes out 0.8 or less, that's normal for men. If it's 0.9 or less, that's normal for women. But if it's 0.85 or greater for men, that's obese or overweight. And if it's 1.0 or over for women, that's obese or overweight. Now, what that simply means, if you measure your waist and it's 40, and you measure your hips and it's 40, that's 1. That means you're overweight, you're at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease, and you need to do something about it. But that's also the best way to measure improvements in overall body conditioning and health. And it's easy and it's quick to do. Let's just talk about obesity for a moment and overweightness and get some definitions here. Obesity is defined as a weight that is higher than what is considered as healthy given the height of an individual. Well, okay, that's nice, but what does it mean? Well, if you're looking at body mass index, if it's 30 or higher, that's obese. If it's 40 or higher, that's morbid obesity. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And if it's 18.5 or less, that's underweight. And really, honestly, I've seen a lot of underweight patients, especially teenage and 20-something girls who think they are overweight when they are grossly underweight. So those are BMI, but we'll look at that at the waist-hip ratio as a better benchmark. If it's 1.0 or greater, then that's not good. You need to change that, and that's a good way to do a measurement rather than calculating BMI. Let's go back to morbid obesity. There is a level of overweightness that is just a bit overweight. That's where a person needs to lose less than 20 pounds to get to their target goal. And then there is obese, which is over 50 pounds. And there's morbid obesity, which is, well, beyond the 50. Morbid obesity is defined as the person's weight is now causing significant health issues. And I'm not just talking it's hard to get out of bed or you get out of breath. It's back pain, knee pain, degenerative diseases. It's going to start to cause diabetes. It's already causing heart disease and kidney disease. It's already causing problems with the large and small intestine because of the pendulous weight that is being forced upon them. It's already causing lung disease and lung problems because it's hard to move enough oxygen to support that amount of body mass. Morbid obesity is an increasing problem. Remember that study I told you about? Well, if you go back to it, you'll find that if you find that chart, it's got the United States map on there, and there are red and even black states. Well, if it's dark red or black, that means people are morbidly obese to the tune of 25%. That's 25% of the population is so overweight that their weight is going to cause them to die at a younger age and have more disease in the process. Well, let's look to better guidelines for a superior diet. Proper ratios of protein, carbohydrates, and fats is really, really key. Now, we have two things here. We have 35, 35, 30, and 30, 40, 30, and that is going to depend upon whether you need higher proteins or higher carbohydrates. If you're an individual that tends towards glycemic problems or blood sugar control issues, then you want more complex, you want more proteins and less carbohydrates, so that's the 30, 40, 30. And if you're not that, then you use 35, 35, 30 as the ratio for the consumption of good proteins, good carbohydrates, and good fats. I'm assuming that you're going to eliminate as many of the bad fats as you possibly can. The quantity is based upon caloric demand. Carbohydrates should be between 50 and 150 grams. Protein is 1 to 2 grams per pound of body weight, and then the rest of that is fats. And yes, you need to consume fats. It's important. So that's the proper ratios and how we come up with the basic general guidelines for a superior diet. Now we're going to give you an example. We're going to have a 62-year-old male. By the way, this is me. 62-year-old male, 220 pounds, and 6'2" with moderate activity. If I calculate my benchmarks, if I calculate my BMR, my basal metabolic rate, I get 2160 as my BMR, and that means I need 3,300 calories per day as a caloric need. That means I need to consume 3,300 calories per day to keep a zero weight change. Now, if I want to lose weight, say I want to bring that 220 down to 205, then what should happen is I'm going to have to reduce that 3,300 calories down a day down by at least 500 calories, because that is what is necessary to lose 1 pound of weight per week. That is, a 500 calorie deficit per day gives a 1 pound per week weight loss. And then if I'm underweight, well, I have to consume over that. Well, most people don't need to worry about underweight. They need to worry about overweight. And so we got to calculate the proper amounts, or the correct amounts of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. So for weight loss, 220 grams of proteins, carbs around 75 grams. And how many grams is 75 grams? Well, guys, let me give you an idea. Let me give you a good visual. You take that Kit Kat bar and you eat 1.5 sticks of that Kit Kat, you've gotten 75 grams of carbohydrates. In other words, your carb load is done for the day. Now that's not very much. As long as you're eating it in sugar, it's going to be not very much. But if you're going to use that in complex carbohydrates, it's a very different thing. So 75 grams of carbohydrates and 102 grams of fat. For weight maintenance, look at the shift change here. 135 grams of fat and 125 grams of carbohydrates, because this right here gives me the 3,300 grams of calories needed based upon the calculations of the amount of carbohydrates liberated from each of these items consumed per day. Well, if calculating your BMR and then the carbohydrate, protein, and fat percentages is a little too complicated for you, or you just don't want to spend the time doing that, that's okay. That's not unusual. So let me give you a couple of other guidelines for a superior diet. One is called Eat by Color. There's a very good book that is out that is called Eating by Color, and it is a diet based upon the color of foods. Blue food, red food, yellow food, white food, green food. They're all different colors, and you eat your foods based upon making sure that you consume the proper amounts of colors of foods in your diet. And they explain all of that. It's kind of fun, kind of interesting, and all you have to do is make sure you eat one, certain number of green foods, certain number of yellow, certain number of brown, certain number of white, certain number of blue foods each and every day. So that's kind of interesting. There is the Paleolithic diet. There was a big fad on that several years ago. But the Paleolithic diet is also called the caveman diet. And the basic idea is, if you were a caveman, what would you be eating? Well, you certainly wouldn't be eating ice cream. And you certainly wouldn't be eating beef every day, because if you were a caveman, you had to go out and kill the beef with a stone axe or a spear. And that means you're not going to do that real often because of the dangers inherent and the difficulty inherent in doing that. But what you would be doing is eating a whole lot more of things that you could raise yourself or glean yourself from going out in the environment. So that is a high natural foods, vegetables, fruit, grains, poultry, and even fish in the diet. And that's a good guideline. There are quite a number of good books, and that website I told you about earlier, Paleoz, has some excellent guidelines, some great diet recommendations, and even meal preparations and how to do them. Well, let's look at something that is also important for dietary guidelines, and that's fluid intake. 40% of our body weight in ounces is the benchmark for appropriate fluid intake. Well, let's put that in real terms. If you weigh 200 pounds, that's 80 ounces of fluid. That's that's 3/4 of a gallon almost of water intake. And I'm talking water, fruit juices diluted, or some of the energy drinks, not some of the electrolyte replacement drinks, not the energy drinks. Energy drinks are bad. They're just a bad idea, because all they're doing is trying to give you a boost in energy at the expense of your health. So 40% of our fluid intake in percentage of body weight in ounces is what we should be taking in. Most people, I'm talking like 80% of folks out there fall way short of this. Most people drink maybe 20 ounces, 24 ounces of water or appropriate fluids per day. Coke, tea, coffee do not count as fluid intake because most of those either spike your insulin or act as a diuretic and cause you to lose fluid. So most people are dehydrated all day long and they don't know it. When your mouth is dry and you don't feel like you can get a good glob of spit going on, you're dehydrated. When you are out and doing stuff and you suddenly feel thirsty, you're past dehydration. You're already dehydrated, and now your body finally, your brain finally triggered a high enough level of awareness to make you feel like you should go get something to drink. You need to drink more water every day. Most people are dehydrated all day long. Well, there are additional nutrients that are needed for most people, but those are specific nutrients that are needed and based upon diagnosed conditions and not guesswork and not anecdotal evidence. And anecdotal evidence is, well, my brother took this and it was good for him, it's good for you. That's called anecdotal evidence. That's the person telling you that I know your condition is the same as I know my brother's condition was, and this is what he did to treat his condition, so this treatment will work for you. That's so filled with guesswork and assumptions, it's not even funny. You shouldn't use anecdotal evidence, and you shouldn't use guesswork. And by the way, if you're going down to your local if you're going down to your local health food store or your big box health food store and asking them, saying, well, I have this, what do I do? Well, this guy that's worked in there for the last couple of years that got a high school degree but never could complete a college degree telling you what to do you really want to base your health on an individual who is just reading the label of what he's selling in his store? Or do you want to actually get something that's right for you? You should really come up with the proper nutrients for specific conditions, for specific reasons based upon diagnosis and not guesswork or anecdotal evidence. And that requires an educated individual. So here's these guidelines for a superior diet. They aren't complicated. They're probably fairly radical for you, and as it is for most people, but that's okay. That's because in our society we have gotten so far away from eating good, quality, raw, healthy foods that we now no longer understand what that truly is. So what next? Well, determine which plan or process works best in your life. I gave you a number of them here, a number of different plans you can use, quite a number of different varied guidelines, but they all work. It just depends on which one makes the most sense to you and which one you can incorporate into your busy life on a day-to-day basis that doesn't require a great deal of thinking and high degrees of planning and mostly a high degree of feeling that you're punishing yourself because you got bad health. Don't do that. Set yourself up for success, not failure. Find which plan works best for you. Then the next thing is educate yourself. Do what's smart. Educate yourself on what is best. Learn how to do it correctly, and then just don't overthink it. Don't overanalyze. Don't get yourself don't put your life in paralysis by overanalysis. Don't do that. Just do what's right. And then find an accountability partner. Find someone that you can talk to that can be your aid, your advocate, your help. Not somebody who's going to condemn you. Somebody who is going to congratulate you. Somebody who's going to help you accomplish your goals. And then just do it. Take these steps. Don't take a long time doing it. Don't overthink it. Get somebody there to help you, and then just get with the plan. That's what you need to do. So, hopefully I've given you a great deal of information here, and that you have seen something that has spurred your thinking, that has motivated you to take positive action. Bad diets, being overweight and unhealthy and sedentary is the single major health issue in America today. Be proactive. If you can't change anybody else's, change yours. That's one more that's gotten better than there was yesterday. So take care. This is Dr. Ronald Ritchie saying, get with the program.